Christian, very lucky to be the administrator for their Plenty module. If you don't know about it, you'll be able to find out more later. I also am here with my Church Action for Tax Justice hat on, and my colleague Rosie, who's over there, and I will be presenting on tax and other financial matters later. I also work for Faith for the Climate and Deep Adaptation Forum and Positive News, so kept a little busy, but I'm really delighted to be here today to introduce Professor Southgate, and he is a Professor of Christian Theodicy at the University of Exeter. I am just trying to embiggen, there we go. So you trained originally as a research biochemist, which is really interesting to me. And you've been teaching for the department on the science-religion debate in related areas, environmental ethics and so forth. Sorry, I'm looking at you here on my screen. I'm not sure whether I should be looking at you up there. I feel as though I'm trying to talk to you and I can't quite see you, but hey ho. So your research interests include the problem of suffering in evolution, the concept of glory in the natural world, and in religious poetry, tragic events affecting church congregations, and the science of the origins of life. Chris teaches the undergraduate modules, Evolution, God and Gaia, and Big Questions in Science and Religion. He's got a postdoc and 4 research students at present, and he's welcoming inquiries from other people interested in his areas of expertise. He's written a number of books, including some poetry books, I believe. I'd love to hear some of that at some point. I don't know whether we'll have time today. So if I might, Chris, I'm going to hand over to you. We're going to do the same format as before, hear from you, and then we will have a few minutes of conversation with our neighbours, followed by questions from the audience.
Well, thank you very much, Kat, and I'm delighted to be with you. I'm only sorry to have to work remotely like this because of the trains, but it's a real pleasure to be able to address this conference. I thought Molly's talk was quite splendid, and also I was really encouraged by the questions that were coming in, so I'm really looking forward to our own conversation. And I just also like to acknowledge the sponsorship of the Montgomery Trust for this little talk of mine. So my concern in this time we have together is not so much to try and tell green-minded Christians what to do to care for creation. Molly's talk was a wonderful example of teasing those issues out, but rather to try and connect creation care to the core elements of our faith as praying people, as disciples guided by Bible and tradition. So we don't just understand what to do, but we inhabit at a deep level why this is part of our vocation as those who pray, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done." But first I'm going to outline very briefly a few reasons why these connections can be difficult for Christians to make. So there's first of all some negatives to trawl through to come to the positives. I'm going to go through these very quickly, but I'm very happy to return to any of them in the questions if that's helpful. So first of all, I remember that when I was first thinking about this material with students 30 odd years ago, a prominent evangelical called Tony Campolo published a book called How to Rescue the Earth Without Worshipping Nature. And that was a very interesting title because it revealed a deep suspicion, particularly among conservative Christians, about any language of nature as sacred, or talking about Gaia, or even thinking too much about God indwelling the natural world. And I think those suspicions go back to those repeated suspicions of Yahwistic writers in the Old Testament, about the worship of nature. So that's one problem that lurks behind some Christian difficulties. And here's another one, which is that the New Testament doesn't, in my view, have a medium-term sustainability strategy. We live, certainly for Pauline thought, and this is a Pauline diagram we're looking at here, we're living in the short, present, groaning, longing time, which will be rapidly ended by the consummation of all things. So, the New Testament mentality is not really thinking about the medium term in ways in which we need to be thinking now so much about 2050 and 2100. This is ultimately, I think, foreign to the New Testament worldview. Thirdly, most of our doctrine that doesn't come from Paul comes from John, and we find in John and in the Johannine writings a very complex attitude to the world. Yes, God so loved the world that he gave his only son, but later in the gospel, and especially the letters, the world becomes code for those who oppose Jesus. So if you take a text like 1 John 2 at face value, do not love the world or the things in the world, at face value, it's very unpromising for eco-theology. I'm going through this very quickly as I promised, but as very happy to return to them. Now, Christianity, as we all know, ought to be the most material of all religions, because at its heart is the word of God becoming flesh, not just man, human being, not just human being, but animal, not just animal, but living being, flesh, dwelling among us, sharing the precariousness and interconnectedness of all life. But so much Christian church teaching has rather majored on the fate of our immortal souls and whether we'll get to go to heaven or not, taking away from a focus on the fleshliness and interconnection of all life. Again, appeal to the famous dominion text in Genesis 1, and also to some extent to the fall language in Genesis 3, help to fuel models that place human beings above nature and God way above them both. So there develops a strongly hierarchical view where God is up there or actually beyond the ceiling somewhere. Human beings are here, or actually men are here. Women are below them, and the natural world is done somewhere beneath. The non-human creation is a resource to be exploited rather than something that has a deep and intrinsic relation to its creator. And arguably the rise of modern science played a part in that process. And lastly, among these list of difficulties, it seems to me that so much of the structure of Christian worship, the lectionary, the hymn books, so much preaching is about individual sin and redemption through Christ. Maybe preaching on the creation is slowly coming in, especially with the adoption of a season of creation in many churches. But this has got a long way to go to rebalance itself, and it makes it hard for Christians, for many Christians, to see these issues that we're focused on today as something more than a fringe thing, something more than a hobby, but actually intrinsic to our understanding of our faith. So after that depressing introduction, Now I want to think some more positive thoughts with you. What I would love to see preached more are texts like these, because there are some great resources in the scriptures. And I've picked these three texts because they're all decentering texts. They don't focus on the distinctiveness or even the importance of human beings, but they're superbly eloquent about the majestic character of God's creation, its moment by moment dependence on God, and on creatures' praise of God. So just to come to my favorite locus in the whole of the Psalms, the opening of Psalm 19. Why I love this so much is because of its sense that all creation is responding to God from moment to moment. And I think many people, not just Christians, have an instinctive sense of this. People often say to me, I find God walking in the river valley or up on high Dartmoor. But crucially, what the psalmist is trying to convey here is that creation speaks in a language that we can't quite hear. And I suggest that part of our task as spiritual beings is to keep listening for that voice, to keep placing ourselves in places where we can listen to wild nature and listen to it with all our spirit. And again, I think Molly touched on this, the way in which the pandemic actually encouraged people to make those connections with green places where they were available. And certainly said in that first summer of the pandemic, said River Valley was like the Costa Brava, with everybody trying to make those connections. Alas, just speaking for myself, I think that sense has tended to fade away as the rhythms of previous life return. But part of our vocation, I'm sure, as human animals, part of knowing our place, to come back to one of Molly's phrases, is to learn how to listen with all our resources, scientific, poetic, spiritual, prayerful, to creation's praise of its Lord, praise that doesn't in any way depend on ourselves. Well, I could say quite a bit about the idea of stewardship as our vocation, which is very often proposed in this type of debate. And at its best, it can be seen as a valiant effort to do justice both to that dominion text in Genesis 1 and to the charge in Genesis 2 to till and keep the garden. But as many of you will know, stewardship has been enormously criticized. Stewards in the Bible tend to be dodgy characters at best. And there is still lying behind the metaphor of steward, and metaphors are hugely important in how we construct our thinking, how our imaginations are shaped. Still, there's a sense in stewardship that God is somewhere beyond the ceiling, and here we are, the managers of the creation, which is somewhere beneath us, requiring our ordering. And we might ask, do we know enough? Are we wise enough to attempt the vocation of stewards? This is all going by very quickly, I know, but I sense from the responses to Molly's talk that this is a very alert audience, and you'll pick up on the things that you most need to pick up without difficulty. This is an interesting account of and the human vocation to be created co-creators. It comes from an American theologian called Philip Hefner, writing years ago about human beings as created co-creators. It's in a way a bolder term than stewardship, because it looks forward to a future that will be better than the present, whereas stewardship seems to me to be an inherently cautious metaphor, which suggests that we should try and prevent the future from being worse than the present. So this is a more optimistic metaphor. It acknowledges that we'll need all our God-given ingenuity to help us through. So it's not the ethos of this is not anti-science and technology, as some green thinking tends to be, but also that birthing language, which I was noticing again when I looked back at this text. That birthing language is interesting, and I'll come back to that in just a moment. A third way of thinking about the human vocation is found in places like Aldo Leopold's Sand County Almanac, with his sense that we need to, rather than putting ourselves above the world and thinking that we must be managers, stewards, co-creators of it, that we need to accept that we are no more than plain members and citizens of it. New kids on the block of a remarkably destructive kind, who just need to find their place as those plain members and citizens. And with my long-suffering students, I've in the past sometimes required them to get up and stand on a line with plain members and citizens of the biosphere at one end of the line, and created technocratic created co-creators at the other end of the line, and force them to take up a position and defend it. And memorably and importantly, really, one of my best students years ago, he remained sitting in his chair when I required everybody to get up and stand on the line. And he said, this is a misplaced activity, Chris. So irritating to a teacher, I can't tell you. This is a misplaced activity because it's not a line, it's a circle. And when I pressed him to explain this, what emerged was his perception that it's only by developing the humility to be plain members and citizens of the biosphere that we are then in position to exercise our co-creatorly activity. And that was a really helpful perception, I think a deeply Christian perception, because it is only in it comes back to that Christic model where only a degree of self-emptying allows us to come into the fullness of our vocation. So that was a really interesting, and actually when I think about it, the sense that things are not lines but circles is actually a really important part of the way in which we need to do our reimagining. And again, Molly touched on this with her reference to the circular economy. So if you take away nothing else from this talk but the sense that that we need to think about circles, not lines, then that would be good in itself. But a text which has fascinated me throughout my theological explorations, and which on which I wrote modest little book called The Groaning of Creation, the last two chapters of which are very much about these issues that we're touching on, is this extraordinary text from Romans with goodness knows what Paul was thinking, or how he came up with this sudden digression into the non-human creation. But he has this very strong sense that that it can only know its liberation when human beings can come into their true freedom. And we can see how profoundly that is the case when we think of the way in which the natural world is being oppressed at the moment by our corporate activity as a species. Of course, with very, as Molly pointed out, different parts of the world are conducting the oppression to a very different extent, but still the overall effect is massive on the non-human world. And but the text wants to say that the world is struggling and groaning, but that this is somehow the labor pains of something new that will emerge from it. It'll only emerge from the present state of creation when human beings come into their true freedom, the liberty of the glory of the children of God. And that, to me, is potentially productive of some very interesting metaphors around a possible role for human beings as midwives of the new creation, midwives of the birth of the new creation. That we're not stepping in with our big machines necessarily, but that our first duty is one of deep attention and care, and our expertise is injected only as necessary. And I was trying to sell this thinking to a group of students the other day, and one of them was, and I hadn't encountered this profession before, but one of them was a doula. That's to say, a woman who serves not as a professional midwife, but as an attentive accompanier to someone through the stages of their pregnancy and birth giving. And doula, deriving as it does from that Greek word for a servant, also picks up on that motif of Christic service rather than domination. And so there seemed to me to be some very generative thoughts to be derived from meditating on that passage and thinking about the extent to which human beings, if we were free from our current idolatries of consumerism and growth and all the other things that tend to dominate our imaginations, if we could be freer in the spirit, how that might enable us to be, in some sense, the accompaniers of the birth of the new creation. Of course, one of the difficulties of this debate is that there's nobody with a white hat who can throw rocks at the people with the black hats. We all have a significant impact on the non-human world as technological modern humans. And as I say, it's a matter not simply of thinking about our impact, but of seeing it in spiritual terms. That I think that this is where this quotation from Wendell Berry is so important and useful, recognizing that we're continually that as animals, we of course feed off the rest of creation and use it for all sorts of purposes, but it is how it is done that makes the difference between sacrament and desecration. And now I want to come for a moment onto a very tricky area, which is the area of food. I'm enormously struck by the extent to which the debate about environmental issues and climate change has been focused on issues of energy. And of course, fossil fuels are enormously important parts of the climate change debate. But there's a sense in which that whole technology and energy policy and so on is that bit more abstract and difficult to grasp hold on. I think we're learning it. We're forced to learn it much more intimately now that all of a sudden domestic energy is so much more expensive, and many of us find ourselves staring at our smart meters in a gloomy kind of way. So we're learning again much more about energy, but it's not a theme that so easily connects itself with spiritual resources in the way that food does. And so I think that there needs to be in our conversation around these issues much more of a focus on food, which takes us back into the great scriptural resources that there are around food, and how the most basic of prayers is that thanksgiving to God over food, and that most basic of communal practices is the sharing of food. And we cannot duck out of the fact that that food production is therefore a huge issue, and a very difficult one among Christians. So just to touch on it, because we can't avoid it, I remember discussing eschatological vegetarianism with a group of Christians in East Devon a few years ago, and it turned out, so I embarked on this, and then it turned out that they almost all were cattle farmers or the spouses of cattle farmers. And indeed, we were sitting looking at an ancient bit of Devon pasture which had been used to rear animals for many centuries. And so these are very difficult debates, but they are very important and unavoidable, and we need to pick through them, as I do with my students. And so I offer them the thought that perhaps one could derive Christian vegetarianism from the Genesis 1 text and the apparent lack of meat eating there, that we could, as Andrew Lindsay would, for instance, we could derive Christian vegetarianism from that Romans 8 text, and from a sense that that would be to cease to use animals in any way would be to liberate them from their groaning. And then I pick up on some of the wonderful work that David Clough and colleagues have done on the extent to which the use of animals, especially for food, has involved a great cruelty, particularly in intensive farming. But then I also offer them that climate change argument, which is hinted at on the previous slide, and I am very struck by the way in which that last argument in particular captures the imagination of younger people to a great extent, and I think this is it is a really difficult area and easy to try and avoid. But all I'm trying to say is that I feel that it must not be shirked in this exploration that we need to do together. So finally, I find myself asking, what is a Christian contribution to the climate change debate? What might a Christian say that any sensible person wouldn't say anyway? And this is a list that I came up with in conversation with students recently, that we can give an account of why human beings are the way they are, and why our tendency to make gods out of ourselves ultimately can result in some of the ways in which we have organized the world. I point to the work done in the World Council of Churches on the fundamental linkage between justice, peace, and ecological issues. Few things, as we have seen so brutally this year, few things are as unecological as war, and the world cannot settle to peace while it is in such a state of radical inequality. Hope, I think one of the fascinating things about the pandemic was asking the question, what is authentic hope for us? And then three other motifs, the resources that we have for lamenting our present situation, for presenting it before God in worship, especially using the Psalms, really important. And then I'm going to come on briefly to these last two, Sabbath and Eucharist, because these seem to me to be really important inheritances from the tradition, and they're very poorly used at the moment, I sense. Sabbath is very difficult in our contemporary world. And I'm not one who says, well, it's Sunday and you can't do this, you can't do that, and you can't do the other on Sunday because that's not, forbidden. I think I see Sabbath as much more that time when people have an opportunity to get back in touch with the person that they really are. Perhaps they're able to readopt the hobby that they neglect because of their crazy work-life balance. Perhaps they get to walk along the river. Perhaps they have time to remember that the life they've been given is God's gift from day to day, and that that to quietly insist on the importance of rhythms of life that contain that space for getting back in touch with who you really are seems to me of huge importance. So we are, however we understand that, fundamentally a Sabbath keeping animal. And also, Christianity has at the heart of its worship the enormous resource of Eucharist, the great place where we retell the story of God's creation and our place in it, where we rehearse how God took flesh and dwelt among us, blessed us and gave his very life for us, when we pray the Spirit on ourselves and on food, that God might dwell in us anew, feed us and strengthen us for the journey. But so detached from its origins in a fellowship meal is contemporary Eucharist, so preoccupied so often with being miserable about being not worthy to gather up the crumbs under God's table, that we seem to me so, to such a great extent, have lost sight of the deep significance of this feast and its connection with the wider world and with our flourishing and the flourishing of other creatures. So that's the single greatest challenge I'd issue to through you to your churches would be, how can we return the communion service to being a genuinely ecological feast? Would you like me to stop there, Kat, or have I got?
I'd like you to carry on all day, Chris, but I'm not going to let you. Thank you so much for that. That was really helpful. We're running a little slow, but I think we do have some likely questions for you. So if you're happy to stay here with us for a moment, we're not going to go into the. Sorry, I'm interrupting you. Go for it.
I'll just make one more observation, if I may. I'll skip some stuff now, but I did want to. I did want to come back to the theme of time. Time is very distorted in our world, and perhaps that's owes in some mindsets, it owes something to that lack of the New Testament lack of a medium term thinking. And perhaps it owes something to the fact that my generation, which alas still runs the world, was told when we were young that there would be no medium term future because nuclear catastrophe was so likely. So that somewhere deep in the Western, the late middle-aged Western psyche is the sense that there is no medium-term future, but also the sort of neoliberal economics against which Molly has waged such eloquent war, of course, discounts the future. It discounts it profoundly over against the present. And I found myself thinking with Greta Thunberg, how dare you? How dare we discount the future in that way? But I think that Christianity's sense of the linearity of time, proceeding from creation to cross to eschaton, doesn't help us develop what Moltmann calls for on this slide, the integration of the human history of progress into the rhythms and cycles of the ecosystem. So indeed, we have to find our way back into the garden. We have to, in some sense, make our cities into gardens, but we need to recover also the rhythms on which gardens depend. We need to recover, in other words, texts like this, and to recognize that it's not all about the hurtling towards some mythical growth. Thank you very much.
Very much in mind with the saying we have in adaptation, which is the situation is urgent, we need to slow down. And I think that's a little bit about perhaps being less concerned with saving ourselves and more saving future generations from the planet. I was very struck personally about how you talked about our lack of our falling connection with God's creation and nature. And I think also with one another as well, it's so much become about individual salvation instead of the salvation of the community, ourselves as brothers and sisters in Christ. I think one thing that you could do just now, Christopher, is perhaps share your screen, stop your screen share rather. And if we may, we'll go straight to a few questions because we're running a little late. So if anybody has, I see a pencil already raised there, quick off the mark. Gentleman in this stripy jumper. Yes, that's you.
Thank you very much for a very concentrated, very rich introduction to some themes about our theology and our creation. Great and has been one of my reflections that the foundational of theology in relation to creation and is actually our theology of God. What is God like? What is he and she? What is his relationship to the creation? And we take in her seriously. Where does that place us as Christians? Who are interested particularly in the environment with very important issues.
Thank you. Could you hear that clearly, Christopher, or shall I?
No, I can't hear the question at all, I'm afraid. You'll have to repeat.
So the gentleman was asking, doesn't our relationship with the environment and our obligations to care for it or our interest in it relate very much to our theology of God, him or herself, and how we understand his or her relationship with creation, and deriving from that where we sit in relation to creation and the environment.
Absolutely. And for years I taught this all-year course, which is called God, Humanity and the Cosmos, which was about enabling the students to construct a model of those relationships I mean, there's so much work, I think, to do to recover a sense of God's profound indwelling of the creation. That, of course, as the Muslims say, God is nearer to us than our jugular vein, but nearer to the blade of wheat than is the ground, and to recover that sense while retaining a Christian view and not kind of dissolving into a sort of neo-animism, that seems to me to be a really important piece of spiritual as well as intellectual work. and it's the dualisms that beset us. Spirit is better than matter, men are better than women, rationality is better than emotion, heaven is better than earth. Those things bedevil that exercise, it seems to me. So absolutely, how we understand God, how we express our sense of God in worship, vastly important.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. Yes. Thank you,
Yes, thank you very much indeed. I would like to make a connection with yesterday evening's talk. I don't remember whether you were listening to that. One of the very important points that Paul Kingston made was the importance of the monastic witness. And one thing I didn't hear today was any reference to asceticism, the Christian ascetic tradition, another thing that is often very much misunderstood. And what I think we learn from the monastic witness is the importance of asceticism as the Christian way of life. And it means that the sort of thing that many people here have been talking about, simplicity, freedom, essentially, freedom from consumerism, from being tied to material things, actually transforms our vision of them. It doesn't simply have practical importance for our footprint. That is also what enables us to see God in the world. And another thing that we learn from monasticism as a paradigm of Christian living very much is rediscovery of the rhythms of time. And there may not be a sort of medium-term perspective in the New Testament, but there is definitely the idea of redeeming the time, that every moment we spend is lived to the full and made an offering to God, essentially. So, the question really is, would you agree with the importance of this ascetic element and the monastic example in recovering it?
Thank you. So Christopher, I'm not sure that you were able to be at Paul Kingsnorth's online talk with us last night. No. He made some reference during the evening to the monastic tradition and the importance of asceticism in Christian way of life, and I guess the ways in which that approach to living can help us not be conformed to the patterns of the world. And so I think, if I'm interpreting your question properly, it's whether you have observations on the amount of regard we should have for that approach, that simplicity in our way of living, and that monastic approach as a way of pulling back from our consumerist world.
And also a way of redeeming the cycle.
And the different, yeah, absolutely, and the different approaches to the passage of time and the cycles of time.
Absolutely. So I've got great. Sorry, I didn't hear the initial question, but I've got great sympathy with it. I think there are splendid insights to be gained from the monastic tradition. Not least the sense that of being accountable to others for the economy of one's life, both one's spiritual practice, but also one's material practice too. One of the things that impresses me about the Iona community is that members have to give an account of their finances to one another, and that seems to me a very healthy breakdown of some of those privatized taboos that we tend to have. Yes, I think my difficulty with asceticism is only if it veers into a life-denying, matter-denying tendency, which it need not do. Personally, I would want to see it at its best. It's an exercise of freedom. I do not need X. I do not need Y. Therefore, I will distance my life from X and Y in order to become more free, not X and Y are forbidden because I'm an ascetic practitioner, if you see what I mean. It seems to me it needs to be approached in that positive spirit, but I think enormous wisdom attaches to it. Yes, thank you.
So
In
asceticism without
order to have the
dualism.
right relationship with X or Y.
Yes, yeah. Thank you. Well, sadly, we're out of time now, so thank you to all of the questioners, and thank you so much, Professor Southgate, for what was a really thought-provoking talk.